Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you guys so much. I'm so glad to see so many of you come out. Not just my students, but other people as well. It's really exciting. Very special presentation for you today for the Festival for Arts and Sciences at Middlesex County College. Acclaimed writer and historian and storyteller, and actually old friend of mine and my family's as well. Mr. Gerald Fierst is here with his program entitled The Legacy of Courage. Jerry and I actually go back a very long way. Believe it or not, when I was about 10, he was my after-school acting and drama teacher, so the little sort of shtick that I do in class is the original producer is here. You know, as historians, sort of one of the things that we look at, or the things we try and find, is the similarities in the world around us. You know, we try and find those threads that connect the regions of the world, the eras of history, and we try and find those things that connect all of humanity together. And it's a sort of sobering truth that one of the things that really does connect all of mankind together are these issues of prejudice and genocide and racism and Holocaust. And I've come to the understanding that the best sort of weapon that we have against these things is our memory, is our ability and our willingness to think about these things, to talk about them, to engage them. And what's really amazing, and I've really come to discover this as a teacher, is that it doesn't matter how we do it, right? Whether it's in the classroom or through books and journalism, whether it's in the movie theater or on television, any chance we have, any opportunity we have to talk about these things, to engage in this kind of material, it gives us ammunition for the future that maybe we won't have to, you know, endure these things eternally. So to that end, Jerry is here today to give you his sort of very unique an interesting perspective, a new way of thinking about the ideas of racism and prejudice. I'm so happy that he could be here, as I said. It really means a lot to me. I'm glad you guys could be here as well. So without further ado, if you will, please help me welcome Mr. Gerald.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you all different kinds of stories. I became involved with Holocaust stories, with the Jewish Shoah. In 1985, I was an actor and a writer, and I was working with a director named Win Hanman from the American Place Theater in Manhattan. And Win, I brought in some monologue that I had written, and Win said, "Oh, you're a great writer, I want you to write more." And I had to go figuring out what I was going to write about, and I happened upon a book called Civic Tales of the Holocaust by Yafa Eliach. These are true oral histories that she collected. She herself grew up in a shtetl, a small Jewish town called, it's gone out of my head now. But her mother and grandmother were the photographers in the town. And if you go down to Washington, D.C., to the National Museum of the Holocaust, you will see the faces of the people of her town. She spent 25 years and a small fortune, more than $500,000, traveling around the world to the few survivors of that town after World War II. There were like 30 people who had gone to different parts of the world: Russia, Israel, the United States, Canada, South America. And she found photographs, either that they had mailed to relatives who had emigrated away, or which they had managed to carry with them when they themselves survived by hiding in caves, pig pens, under a barn, things like that. But they kept a picture. And that memory was something that they held on to. And she created this tower, if you go to the National Museum, that's 4 stories tall, of photographs of these people. And when you look at them, what you realize is that they're just like us. Even though it happened a long time ago, they're dressed like us. They're sitting there having a picnic. They're getting married. You know, there's a baby. There's somebody playing with their dog, right? That basically they're people just like us. And what you discover is, come on in. That's why I'm chatting, because I was waiting for the last few people to arrive. What you discover is that if you know somebody's story, you discover they're people just like us. You know, we were discussing before you all arrived, we were discussing the royal wedding, right? And you know, the thing that's, because you have to admit, even though you might say, oh, who cares? The truth is, we all can't quite resist getting a little bit of like, what? He's not going to wear a ring? Or, oh, what's she going to wear? Or, you know, everybody's a little bit interested. It's because even though they're kings and queens, you still know they're people. You still know that somebody can step on their toes. You still know that they can trip, right? So once you know somebody's story, you can't really hate them. And that's why it's important for the stories to be told. I was at the Passover Seder the other night. And in the Passover Seder, where you tell the story of leaving slavery, it doesn't say that the Jews left Egypt. It uses the word, they left the narrow place. You see, when we only have narrow vision, we're slaved. We're enslaved. It's only by expanding our understanding of the world that we can expand our vision and really be free. So, I'm going to begin, now that the last people have arrived. I'm going to begin, come on in, by teaching you a story. Okay? So, you can take this story home. Put your fingers up. And you're going to have to repeat after me. Okay? You're going to tell this story when you go home. Tell it to a child, or tell it to an old person. Tell it to a friend, whatever. Okay? It goes. 2 goats.
2 goats.
Goat on the eastern hill.
Goat on the eastern hill.
Goat on the western hill.
Goat on the western hill.
One day.
One day.
First goat goes down.
First goat goes down.
First goat crosses the bridge.
First goat crosses the bridge.
First goat eats grass.
First goat eats grass.
First goat goes back.
First goat goes back.
First goat climbs up.
First goat climbs up.
One day.
One day.
Second goat goes down.
Second goat goes down.
Second goat crosses the bridge.
Second goat crosses the bridge.
Second goat eats grass.
Second goat eats grass.
Second goat goes back.
Second goat goes back.
Second goat climbs up.
Second goat climbs up.
One day.
One day.
Both goats go down.
Both goats go down.
Both goats cross the bridge.
Both goats cross the bridge.
Hey!
Hey!
I want to go there.
I want to go there.
Hey!
Hey!
I want to go there.
I want to go there.
Splash!
Flash.
She wasn't very cooperative.
She wasn't very cooperative.
He wasn't very cooperative.
He was very cooperative.
That's not the way to solve a problem.
That's not the way to solve a problem.
Let's do it again. 2 goats.
2 goats.
Goat on the eastern hill.
Goat on the eastern hill.
Goat on the western hill.
Goat on the western hill.
One day.
One day.
First goat goes down.
First goat goes down.
First goat crosses the bridge.
First goat crosses the bridge.
First goat eats grass.
First goat eats grass.
First goat goes back.
First goat goes back.
First goat climbs up.
First goat climbs up.
One day.
One day.
Second goat goes down.
Second goat goes down.
Second goat crosses the bridge.
Second goat crosses the bridge.
Second goat eats grass.
Second goat eats grass.
Second goat goes back.
Second goat goes back.
Second goat climbs up.
Second goat climbs up.
One day.
One day.
Both goats go down.
Both goats go down.
Both goats cross the bridge.
Both goats cross the bridge.
Hey!
Hey!
I want to go there.
I want to go there.
Hey!
Hey!
I want to go there.
I want to go there.
Maybe we can squeeze.
Maybe we can squeeze.
If only the world were as smart as goats. So, you see, really, the simplest stories It's not a complicated, it's really not a complicated lesson, right? It's just hard to do. And that's what the stories are all about. You know, the truth is, I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago, and, you know, well, the first thing I noticed when I landed in Hamburg was that everybody had a really good haircut, right? It's like, whoa, Germany is very prosperous. Germany is very prosperous. Germany is much more prosperous than we are, right? Germany's a big country. It's the center of Europe. It's doing well, right? And yet, you have to think, what an awful legacy, even after half a century, more than half a century, what an awful legacy. And how easy it is for anyone to be led down the path of hatred. When I was working with Yaffa on my play Dancing with Miracles, based on her book Civic Tales of the Holocaust, she told me this story. It's about a rabbi named Israel Spira. He was a very famous rabbi in Poland before the war. And he, even though he was an Orthodox rabbi, a Hasidic rabbi, you all know what the Hasids are? With the black hats, long coats, right? Even though he was a Hasidic rabbi and a dynastic rabbi, he inherited the throne from his father. He was also cosmopolitan. He was a worldly man. And so, like a lot of middle-class Poles, he would take his family on vacation, just like you and me, right? Even though maybe their clothes were a little different, they were still human beings. And they would go to the famous German spa of Baden-Baden, the famous cure, right? Drink the water, sit in the hot baths, right? Get your fingernails done. And the rabbi had this custom. He and his little girl would wake up early in the morning and go for a hike. And they would walk through the town as the shopkeepers were opening up, pulling up their iron grates, putting out their goods, and they would wish everyone good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. And they would end their hike at the greengrocer, at Muller's store. And Muller, they would say, good morning, Herr Muller. And Muller would say, good morning, Herr Rebbener. And he would always give the little girl an orange. And that's what they would do every year, 2 weeks, right? Like going to Cape Cod, right? But then the war came. And when the war came, first travel was restricted. And then everybody was put into a ghetto, right? So the ghetto was not just an area where you lived. It was an area too small for the number of people. So you were now living in an apartment with, instead of having 4 people, you would have 20 people. You know, blankets would be put up for some privacy. Water became difficult to get. Plumbing would fall apart, you couldn't get parts, things started to disintegrate. Food was bad, disease broke out, typhus. The rabbi's wife died of typhus. His little girl was outside on the street playing when there was an action. Soldiers came into the ghetto and started to shoot anybody on the street, and she was murdered. And then finally, the ghetto was liquidated. The rabbi, who at that time was 54 years old, was put onto a cattle car and taken to a slave camp. Not to a death camp, but to a slave camp, Janowska. Janowska was a place where people worked until they fell over and died. And then they would be dragged away and thrown in a pit. And Janowska was ruled by a commandant who was called the Black Angel. A man so cruel he had no name. Instead, he was known as the Angel of Death. And he himself would meet the trains as they arrived to see who was young and strong enough to be sent to the factory. And for those who were too old or too weak, they would just summarily be taken out into the field and thrown into a pit and shot. And so it was that the rabbi, who was now 54 and was already sick and malnourished, knew that his time had come. Even as everybody was pushed off the train, even as they were made to strip and stand there naked, the rabbi simply said his prayers, never lifted his eyes, but just prepared to meet his ancestors. Even as he could hear the black angel giving the sentence to those who came before him. Left, which was to death, or right, which was to the factory and a few more months of life. The rabbi never looked up until finally he was standing in front of the table, in front of the commandant, in front of the black angel. Number! Nobody had a name. You only had your number. Number! And only now did the rabbi lift his eyes and look into the face of the angel of death. And then the rabbi said, "Good morning, Herr Muller." For the commandant was none other than the greengrocer from Baden-Baden. And Muller, hearing the familiar voice, said, "Spira? Reb Spira? Is that you? My God, what is a man like you doing in a place like this? What kind of world have we made? What have we done? And your little girl, where is she?" And now the rabbi started to cry, dead, murdered. "Rabbi, forgive me. Forgive us all. As long as I am here, you will be safe." Right. And he sent the rabbi to life. Well, through many miracles and many adventures, the rabbi did survive and eventually came to the United States and went to Brooklyn, settled in Brooklyn, remarried, started a new family, lived to be 104 years old, right? And in his study on 58th Street, as he told this story, at the end he said, "So you see, my friend, how important it is that we bless each day by wishing our fellow man a simple good morning." So you see, it's very important that we realize those simple little things like a good morning, what a difference they make. When you go out today and start to pass people, say good morning to them. It'll startle them a little bit, right? It's like, what do you want from me, right? But by acknowledging each other, we suddenly discover the humanity that's in everybody's lives, the common story that we all hold as people. I've been, as a storyteller, traveling around the country. I tell stories in many different places. One of the, what can I say? One of the strangest places I ended up was the Juvenile Detention Center in Seattle, Washington. A locked facility. Turn over your wallet, turn over your cell phone, turn over your keys, right? Your identity essentially is stripped. No name, just a number, right? You go through a double locked door. And then everybody's in orange uniforms. But these are kids, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And I was asked to tell them Holocaust stories. And when I got there, I looked around me and I thought, well, it's only an hour. I can manage. Right. So they take me down into the basement where the library is, And there are chairs set up, much like this room, and the boys march in. Now, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, but they're big, right? I mean, people get bigger and bigger as I get older and older. So they're big. And this really big kid, you guys are too young probably, but there used to be a football star called the Refrigerator. This guy looked like the Refrigerator, right? Really big kid. He takes a chair and puts it in the center aisle and sits there. And he's waiting for my story. And I look at him and I think, what story can I tell? And so I began with a story a true story, just many of these stories that I'm telling you are true, even though they seem like they can't be true, about the Sioux Indian tribe in 1890. Now, in 1890, the Great Indian Wars were over. And the reservation was already established. According to the treaties, because you couldn't go off the reservation, you couldn't go hunting, in other words, right? The cavalry, the army, would bring you food during the winter. But the food wasn't delivered. And it was a hard winter, and the snows were heavy. And there was no food. And finally, everything had been eaten, even the mice. And the people were starving. And there were two young boys. Their names were Head Chief and Young Mule. They were 12 and 13. And Head Chief said to Young Mule, let's go off and hunt. And Young Mule said, we can't. And Head Chief said, why not? We're starving. And so they got on their ponies and they went off the reservation onto a farm. And there they saw a cow. And Head Chief, he took his gun and he shot the cow. And they started to butcher it. And as they were loading the meat up onto their horses, along came Boyle, the farmer. And he started to swear at the boys. And as he swore at the boys, Head Chief lost it. And he took his gun and he shot Boyle. And then Young Mule said, what should we do? And Head Chief said, bury him. And so they made a shallow grave and they left the white settler there and they went back to the reservation. And they went to the elders and they said, we don't want trouble. The time for fighting is over. But we don't want to be taken into the town and we don't want to be hung by the neck. We want to die like our fathers would die. We want to die like braves. Tell the soldiers to come, and we will come riding to them. And we will be on our horses, and we will count coup. And they can shoot us from our horses. Let us die like men. And so when the sheriff came to the reservation, the elders said, the boys have turned themselves over to us, and they have told us what they want. This is the way it must be. And the sheriff said, but it's not our way. And the elders said, sometimes it's better to change your ways. And so a date was set. And it was the early spring, probably around this time of year. And on the day that the army was to march to go and get the boys, it was like a picnic. The settlers from the town came with their children and their wives in their buggies. And they came to see the last of the Indian braves. They came to see the boys riding on their ponies with their headdresses and their coup sticks. There was a marching band, and the soldiers all had brightly polished guns. And they all came, and they were in the valley, and they waited for the boys to come over the crest. And when the boys appeared, everybody was astonished. And there was not a sound. Not a sound, even as the boys slowly trotted down the hill. Even as the boys came to the line of soldiers and touched them lightly with the coup sticks upon the shoulder. Everybody was just astounded, for it was like the past had come alive again. And the boys turned and went back up the hill. And then they were silhouetted on the crest of the hill. But now they turned and started to come down on a gallop. And as they came down on a gallop, suddenly the women from the Sioux, they started to shout a war cry. And as they shouted, it was as if everybody awoke. And now the soldiers began to fire. But still the boys broke through the line. They counted more coups. They twirled their horses around. They swirled back up the slope. But now a bullet went through the back of Head Chief, and he fell from his horse. And another bullet shot the pony out from under Young Mule. And now Young Mule pulled his knife, but a bullet went through his chest. And now the two boys lay on the ground in a pool of blood. And the officer of the cavalry came and shot them both in the head. And then everybody looked. And what they saw were two enemies. What they saw were two boys, 12 and 13. And suddenly they were ashamed. And the soldiers put down their guns and marched away. And the settlers followed. And the band followed and did not play. And the Sioux people came and took their children home and washed their bodies and buried them. And in that pool of blood upon the wet earth, two eagle feathers from the headdresses lay, and someone took them and tied them to a large rock that stood in that field. And that wind and rain eventually washed the feathers away. But the rock is still there. And to this day, when people go and see it, they remember and they tell the story of the last children who died for their people, and of how, though the feathers are gone, the rock will always remain. Memory is a hard thing. When I was in Germany, saw everybody's good haircuts, I couldn't help but think of how strange it was that, that people died. That people, not only Jews, communists, gypsies, leftists, all sorts of people, died in a kind of national bloodletting because they did not see each other. Is that a cell phone? And yet you have to release memory at a certain point, because if you're stuck in the narrow place, right, that's all you have. You're always in the past. As I started to tell that story in the juvenile detention center, the boy, the refrigerator, sort of like grunted and said, "Yeah, I know about that." "Okay, I'll tell you another story then." He said, "Go ahead." Suddenly, it was interesting. I was only telling him a story. But, he was only 13 or 14. He was becoming a child again as he heard the story. And also I was talking to him. And as I acknowledged him, the whole dynamic of the room started to change. And so I told them this tale from the African American tradition. In Africa, before the people were stolen away, they knew magic. And they had wings, and on those wings they could soar in the sky higher than high. In Africa, the people could fly. But under the harsh whip of slavery, why all the magic was driven from their heads and their wings were left far behind. But there was one old man named Toby, and he remembered the words. He remembered the magic words. Now, he worked on a plantation down in the fields planting the rice. And next to him was a young woman named Sarah. She had a baby on her back. And over them stood Driver, the overseer, who kept them working with a thin, cruel whip that he would crack if ever they should stop. And up on the hill in the big house, that's where the master lived. Master man, who owned them all. Master man, who sat on his porch with a gun across his lap. Now one day, as the slaves were working in the fields, Sarah's baby began to cry. Shh, shh. Hush, hush. Don't cry, sweet child, don't cry. And Sarah sank down low into the wet earth. She tried to disappear into the mud. She was afraid that Driver would come and crack his whip. Hush, hush. Hush, hush. But it was too late. Driver had heard. Shut that baby up, he said. Shut that baby up. Don't hurt me. Don't hurt my child, cried Sarah. But Driver came striding across the field, lifted up his arm, and crack! Down came the whip across the mother's shoulders. Don't hurt my baby, don't hurt my child. But Driver lifted up his arm again, and crack! Down came the whip across the baby's belly. And now Driver was lifted up his arm one more time when there was Toby by Sarah's side, whispering in her ear, saying the words, saying the magic words, Okalle, Okalle, Okalle tu batalle, Okalle, Okalle, Okalle tu batalle. And the words, they sank down deep into Sarah's soul. They came up on her breath and onto her lips and out into the air, and the strength that flowed into her arms and her legs, and up she rose into the sky. And all the slaves, they stopped their work to stare. And they watched as Sarah took her baby in her arms and soared above their heads in circles round, over the fields and over the trees and over the horizon to freedom land. That's where she did fly. And then Driver, he turned to the slaves on the ground and said, you ain't seen what you think you saw. You ain't seen nothing, understand? That was tricks and smoke and magic and illusion. You get back to work and don't you breathe a word of this to no one. Yeah! And those slaves, they went back to work. But they knew what they had seen. Next day, under the hot sun, Driver, he wouldn't let anyone get a drink. Finally, a boy fell on the ground, unable to move. Driver came ready to crack the whip. There was Toby, old man Toby, whispering the words, saying the magic words. Okalle, Okalle, Okalle tu batalle. And the words, they sank into that boy's soul. They came up on his breath and onto his lips and out into the air. The strength that flowed into his arms, his legs, and up he rose into the sky. And then another boy fell. And there was Toby, whispering the words, and the words began to spread across the fields from slave to slave, and all the slaves were joining hands, singing and dancing. They began to rise up into the sky. And Master Man, up on the hill, he saw his slaves flying away. He came running with his gun. It's that one there. Old man Toby, who knows the words, said Driver. And Master, he took his gun and he pointed straight at old man Toby's heart. And old man Toby, he stood there, looking Master in the eye. Not singing or dancing, but like Moses, like a prophet, ready to lead his people home. And then old man Toby, he shook his head and said, you can't shoot freedom. You can't shoot a man who will dare to fly. And old man Toby, he said the words for himself. And up he rose into the sky. Now there was still a few slaves on the ground. They were afraid to say the words. They'd have to wait their chance to run someday. And Master, he turned to them and said, you ain't seen what you think you saw. You ain't seen nothing, understand? That was tricks, that was smoke, that was magic and illusion. You get back to work and don't you breathe a word of this to no one. Here! And those slaves, they went back to work. But they knew what they had seen. And they did tell. They told their children, and their children told their children, and their children told their children, and their children told me. And now I'm telling you. Okale, okale, okale dubatale. You can't shoot freedom. You can't shoot a man who will dare to fly. During the Passover Seder, one of my cousins said to me, because it's a long meal, right? You're reading stuff, you're talking, it's a little bit of anarchy, especially because I have a family that gets together, all the cousins. We've been doing it since we came to America, so it's almost 100 years, and they get together. We have fourth and fifth cousins, first time you see each other for a whole year. Even while it's all going on, people are talking. So my cousin is talking to me about the economy, right? Because Obama had just made his speech and everything. My cousin says, it's the illegals. My cousin lives in Ridgewood, New Jersey. He's a very successful doctor. He hires illegals to work in his garden, right? I mean, let's face it, right? They're getting free medical care, they're getting free education. That's what's driving our... I just sort of looked at him because, here we are, a fairly successful family after 100 years, right? But the story goes that my great-grandmother, that what happened was in their little town, they were the shopkeeper, the grocer, and they had 5 daughters. And I suppose everybody in the town was probably their cousin, right? And one day, the soldiers come. The Tsar's soldiers come riding. And one of my cousins has her children playing outside in the street. So she runs out of the house to get the children in because she hears the horsemen coming and she's afraid. But she doesn't move quick enough. The little one, the 3-year-old, my cousin Nachman, is still on the curb. So she throws herself on top of the child. And the Cossack, he comes with a sword and hits her. And the sword kills her. And that night, my great-grandmother said, enough, we're leaving. We're going to America. Well, the story isn't that different today. Whether you're coming from someplace in Asia or Central America. I had a kid in Union City tell me the story of his uncle. We were talking about disabilities, and he said, my uncle only has 1 leg. And I said, oh, that's terrible. And then another kid said, and he's illegal. And I went, oh, maybe I don't want to know the rest. And he said, no, he's legal now. He was illegal before. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, well, the first time he walked to the United States, he was illegal. I went, wait a second. He walked to the United States, the kid was from Ecuador, right? And he said, yeah, one day he woke up and he decided he would start walking. I go, but he walked all the way from Ecuador to the United States? Yeah, but they caught him. So what happened? Well, they sent him back. So what did he do? He started walking again. I said, and he walked all the way to the United States again? No, he only got as far as Panama, and then there was a war. And that's when he got his leg shot off. I said, oh my gosh, he got his leg shot off in a war? Yeah, but it was good. Because then my father could get him into the United States legally, and they gave him a new leg. I said, so he's here now with a new leg and he's legal? He says, yeah, so it's good. His only problem is he can't speak English. And I said, oh. So, my great-grandmother never learned to speak English either, right? But that's what it's all about. From the very beginning, whether 400 years ago when Africans were brought here as slaves or today when people from all over the world come. They're still coming to America for the hope of freedom. And freedom doesn't mean just that you can do anything you want. It means that you can be who you are. And that's a really incredible concept. An incredible concept. Not losing tradition. Not forgetting where we come from. But taking that into the future. So, you know, that whole issue, for me politically, when I hear that whole issue of illegals, I think, in some way, we're all illegal. Not because we didn't have our documents, right? Because frankly, documents are a modern thing, right? It's because we all, as Americans, are the people who are, what shall I say, outlaws? You know, coming from places where we couldn't be, right? Breaking out to create a new place. A place that's, you know, still the frontier. Still the place where people are evolving. So Yafa has this story. It's about tradition. It's about how miracles can happen if you can hold on to tradition. In Janowska, the rabbi that I told you about, Spira, right? He made friends with a lawyer. So this is a religious man and an agnostic, right? Someone who deeply believes in God and someone who doesn't believe in God. And you know, when you don't have food, words keep you alive. These two men would get together and tell stories about great meals they had eaten in the past. Right? And sometimes they would argue about God. How could God create a world like this? Then one night, suddenly, in the middle of the night, the barrack lights were flipped on and everybody was told to go out into the field. Quickly, quickly! Naked, they ran out into the winter night, and there was a great pit. And there were 2 towers with machine guns and spotlights. And then they were told that they were to jump over the pit and land on the other side. And those who made it to the other side would live. And those who fell into the pit would find their grave. Well, people started to jump, and of course the pit was too wide. Everybody was falling in. The machine guns were killing them. And the lawyer turned to the rabbi and said, "Why should we be the butt of a joke? Why should we leap? Let us sit down. They can shoot us here. What difference does it make?" And the rabbi said, "No. If it's destined that we jump, then jump we must. And if we fail and fall, then we'll be at the gates of paradise." And so they got to the edge of the pit, and they jumped. And they flew through the air on angel's wings, and they landed on the other side. And the lawyer couldn't believe it. He didn't understand. He said, Rabbi, I don't understand. I understand. We're alive, we're alive. How did you do it? What did you do? And the rabbi said, I held on. I held on to the coattails of my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and all of my ancestors. But you, my friend, how did you do it? And the lawyer said, Rabbi, I held on to you. So, Spira told this story. He was a good storyteller. And he said, and you know how wide that pit was? It was as wide as that street outside, out to 58th Street in Brooklyn, which is a city street, right? Try to jump from one curb to the other. It's impossible, right? So Yafa, who's a historian at Brooklyn College, went to document the story. Historians want proof. And she found a picture of the pit, as wide as a city street. right? When we hold on to the past and are willing to leap into the future, not only do we preserve tradition, but we make miracles happen that can change the world. There are many stories. If you become involved with the Holocaust Center and start to listen to the oral histories of people who have been through all sorts of things, whether it's, slavery or immigration, just the fact that people will walk thousands of miles for freedom, or war, what you discover is that miracles happen. Things that are unaccountable. And that's partially, I took Yaffa's book and made it into a play called Dancing with Miracles, because the true stories, like we say, if someone had written it, you wouldn't believe it, right? That's what's so extraordinary about all of this. I was sitting in the backyard in Bud Lake, New Jersey, one afternoon, and it was a June day. It was a lovely day. I was being served very good cookies and coffee, and this woman named Nettie Blumenthal leans over and she says, "I want to tell you my story. I was 4 years old when the soldiers came into my town. And me and my mother and my sister, we ran up to hide in an attic. And there we were with a few of our neighbors, and we couldn't even move, because if we made the floorboards squeak, the soldiers might hear and look up and see the trap door through which we had fled. We just hid there, hardly breathing, until at last night came. And then we could hear far away singing in celebration, for everyone in the village had been murdered. Only we had been left hidden. But now how are we going to escape? And there was a small window. And someone said, we can lower ourselves out the window into the field and run into the forest to hide. But then everybody looked at the mother and the two children. They couldn't move fast. Children. Who wants to be with children when you have to flee? Leave the children behind. The mother said, no, you can't leave the children behind. So Nettie Blumenthal said they agreed to let the mother go down to the field with the two little girls in her arms, and she would go alone into the forest. And so Mrs. Blumenthal kept on telling me the story. She said, we went into the forest. It was a dark forest. It was the kind of forest you read about in fairy tales, with brambles that rip your clothes and tear your skin, with nothing to eat and nothing to drink. For 3 days and 3 nights, they wandered in the forest. And the mother started to cry so hard that her eyes swelled up and she couldn't see. So the two little girls were leading her like a blind woman. And finally they got to a road. And they felt the pavement under her feet. And when the mother felt the pavement under her feet, she said, what's the use? Let's follow this road wherever it takes us. For whatever's at the end of this road can be no worse than what's going to happen to us here if we just wander through the wilderness. And so they started down the road. Now, all her life, the little girl, Nettie, had heard stories about soldiers coming into Jewish villages. She'd heard stories of the white Russian soldiers, the Cossacks, like my grandmother's Cossacks, right? Who wore white clothes and had gleaming swords and would kill the people left and right. She had heard those stories, and now her mother was taking her back to another army, another group of soldiers. And suddenly she looked and she saw behind the trees the soldiers in white uniforms. just like in the stories. And she started to scream, "Mama, Mama, Mama, there's an army of soldiers, white soldiers are waiting for us up ahead." And the mother, hearing the fear of the little girl, started to scream, "Run, run, run, children!" And they turned around and they ran down the road and around a bend. And there were a group of partisans, freedom fighters, who were waiting, who were standing there, and took them in and preserved them, saved them for the rest of the war. So Mrs. Blumenthal, this nice lady in a backyard in Bud Lake, New Jersey, she tells me this story, and I'm sort of like, "Oh, that's interesting." And she looks at me, because she sees I'm like ignorant, and she says, "Gerald, in that place, at that time, the soldiers didn't wear white uniforms. And there wasn't an army. There was no army in the forest. No. What I saw were angels. I saw an army of angels sending us back to life." So, I don't know. I've heard so many stories now that I begin to believe. I cannot tell you what there is in this world that we cannot see. But I know that there are things that are extraordinary, that can't be measured the way science measures things. And whether you want to call it angels or whether you want to call it spirit, those things can be preserved. But they're only preserved when we open ourselves up, when we open our hearts and our eyes and recognize the humanity that makes us more than just an animal. One last story. I'm going to teach you another story. It's a story that's told in American Sign Language. So you have homework, right? You have to teach 2 goats. You can tell all of these stories, but then you can also do this story, right? Put your fingers up. Take your thumb, put it in between. This, in American Sign Language, is a K. Put it across your chest. It means king. King. Curl your fingers, make a flat C, put it on its side. Q. Put it across your chest, means queen. Queen. So you can be a king, queen, whatever you want to be. Okay? Say it with me. Do the signs. Learn the story. It goes. I am the king or queen of me. I can become whatever I want to be. The sun and me are 2 of a kind. With our hearts, imaginations, and pride. Together, we shine, and shine, and shine. Okay, so now you say the words and do the signs. I'm just going to do the signs. Yeah, well, I didn't say it was going to be easy. Okay.
I am a king or queen of me. I can become whatever I want to be. The sun and me are 2 of the same. With a heart and imagination and pride. Together we'll shine and shine and shine.
Pretty good. Okay, so now do it in silence. with just your fingers doing the talking. And feel the connection as we do it all together. So I hope that you, with your hearts, imaginations, and pride, together tell stories that shine and shine and shine. Thank you all for coming.